The reading this morning is from Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 28 and going through to 31. It's on page 1018 of the Church Bibles. So Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 28. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbour as yourself. There is no commandment greater than this." This is the word of the Lord.
In the name of in the glory of God the Father. So, for those of you who know that The Apprentice has started again this week on television. For those of you familiar with The Apprentice, you'll know 14 or 15 generally hapless people decide to embark upon a journey to follow Lord Sugar around to learn from him as his apprentice in a competition to try and win his approval and his money. In The Apprentice, you'll see that people spend about 10 minutes with Alan Sugar in the boardroom at the end of things, trying to glean wisdom from him and trying to learn how to follow. Now, in the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth is often called a rabbi and his followers disciples with their rabbi for as much as possible. Learn everything that they not just during formal teaching time. Being a disciple, never leaving your rabbi's side. And that commitment of the disciple to stay in the presence of the rabbi that they followed as often as they could, for as long as they could, was beautifully expressed in a blessing of that time that said, thank you, that said this, "May you follow him so closely that the dust that his feet kicks up cover your clothing and face. May you always be covered by the dust of your rabbi." Now, a year ago as a church, we started a journey that began with a prayer, asking God to give us eyes to see and ears to hear as to where the Holy Spirit was leading us as a church. And over the past months, we have in various forms and in various places met together, prayed together, discussed together and decided together on a fourfold vision for the church. That fourfold vision being discipleship, evangelism, service and justice. And of those four, it is today's focus, that of discipleship, which is the most important, because it's from that the other three flow. And at the heart of that commandment of discipleship is the call to the greatest commandment, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our strength. To love the Lord our God with all that we are. In other words, to make God our priority. To make our discipleship the single lens through which we live the rest of our lives. to place Jesus at the centre, to follow our rabbi so closely that we are attentive not only to his leading, but seek to be covered by every speck of dust and glory that emanates from him. And in his teaching, Jesus reveals to us the answers to some of the most fundamental questions that we would ask of ourselves, not only as individuals, but as disciples. The most fundamental questions in some way that we can ask ourselves at all. Who am I? What is my purpose? To whom do I belong? And Jesus showed us in his teaching and in his actions who we are. He showed us that we came from God, that we belong to God, that we were made for God, who gave us a mind to know him, a heart to love him, and a will to serve him. And when the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost on those first disciples, we read of those disciples being set on fire with conviction that through this man Jesus, they had become literally sons and daughters of God. That is who they were, that is who we are. And through Jesus we discover not only who we are, but also our purpose. We become, like those first disciples, pioneers. Pioneers of a new humanity and founders of a new kingdom. A kingdom of forgiven sinners, forgiven for our past sins, given new life in the present and hope for the future. We become committed to one another, regardless of our background, regardless of our ethnic background, our material possessions, common accents, common professions. Every day, what is opened up to us is the potential to be filled with passion and gratitude, unable to get over the sheer prodigality of the grace of God, his standing, ever standing, ready embrace for us. Victor Hugo once wrote that there is one thing stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come. Corporate discipleship, a mutual belonging of life together, was Jesus' big idea. And it was his plan for a renewal of society, a catalyst, an engine for God's kingdom. And that idea of corporate discipleship is found here. Not just here. In churches across our city, across our nation, across the globe. But it's found here. A mixed community of sinners called to be saints. A divine society where the risen Christ is in the glory of the midst of it and the Holy Spirit at work. An inclusive and generous friendship where each person is affirmed as being of infinite worth. A community of love, overflowing in gratitude and wholehearted surrender because we participate in the life of God. That's corporate discipleship, this thing that we call church, worships God and infects the world, seeking the world's transformation. A transformation that begins first in the heart of each one of us. Each one of us, individuals transformed by the grace of God and who live as disciples, believing that not only God has a purpose to bring his kingdom to bear in our lives, but also each of us, individually and together, a purpose by God to bring that transformation about in the communities of which we are part. Back in the early 1980s, Canon David Watson, who was the vicar of St. Michael the Belfry in York, wrote a book called Discipleship. And in that book, he wrote this: Christians in the West have largely neglected what it means to be a disciple of Christ. The vast majority of Western Christians are church members, pew fillers, hymn singers, sermon tasters, Bible readers, even born-again believers. But they're not true disciples of Christ. If we were willing to learn the meaning of real discipleship and actually become disciples, he wrote, the church in the West will be transformed. And the resultant impact upon society would be staggering. Now, that is no idle claim. And we know because it's happened before. It happened in the first century when a tiny handful of timid disciples began, in the power of the Holy Spirit, the greatest spiritual revolution that the world has ever known. Even the mighty Roman Empire, 3 centuries later, yielded to the power of the good news of Christ that transformed those disciples and those who they met. Now, it is a statement of the obvious to say that the fourfold vision that we've adopted as a church, and which we'll be exploring each week over the next month, will not in and of itself bring about that kind of change. Visions written on pieces of paper rarely do. But the first part of that vision seeks not to simply be the next strategy for church growth, but rather to create a culture. If you were ever in America and took a trip to Ford, to the place that makes the cars, if you go into their offices, you'll see on the wall a quote that some attribute to Henry T. Ford, but most attribute to Peter Drucker, that says, strategy eats culture. Sorry, culture, I got that the wrong way around. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's great. Maeve's sitting there who heard this sermon this morning, and she heard me say it and was like, no, you got that wrong. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Part of that quote, the truth within it, is that to create a culture means that everything else that flows from it points to that culture that's being created. And for us to create a culture of discipleship that surrounds all that we do together, places Jesus and our wholehearted, whole-minded, full-strength commitment to him at the centre of our lives once more. And as part of creating that culture of discipleship, we have, over the past year, taken little steps, changing that culture, part of which happens today in our new service pattern, based on the habits of the early church and those first disciples that set out in the book of Acts in chapter 2. And in the book of Acts, when it talks about the early disciples and how they created that first culture of meeting together, it said they did so around 3 areas: prayer and worship, teaching and study, fellowship and sharing. And it's no accident that our new patterns of service, our new rhythms of being, are shaped around those 3 things: prayer and worship, teaching and study, fellowship and sharing. So in prayer and worship, each day in the week we gather in that chapel at 8 a.m. for morning prayer. And it was something of a shock for me to realise this week that we have been doing that for a year. That we started doing that last October. And we do that because the first call of that commandment is to worship fully. for our first duty as a church, as a group of people, being the prayer and worship of God. It's the most important thing we do. It's why we now have, as of today, 2 morning services, to enable more people to join us in that worship. A new evening service that will happen all year round, that enables us to worship God again, to bring our prayer and worship before him because he is our centre. Our new 4 p.m. family service that will happen today, our harvest service. Time together, worshipping and celebrating and praying. All of these centred on the prayer and worship of God. And then teaching and study. Our second Sunday of each month will focus on an extended period of teaching. Next Sunday, Professor John Barclay from the theology department will be coming here, spending an hour with us at 4 o'clock, talking about gift and grace. We are blessed that one of the leading world authorities on the Apostle Paul happens to teach a couple of 100 yards up the road at the university and has agreed to come and share with us to enable us in our study and in our teaching. The following month, in November, Justin Allison, who's just finished his PhD, will be sharing with us on his work and his study. It's creating that room for extended understanding and teaching. And finally, fellowship and sharing. We've heard already from Lindsay, student lunches after this service. There's tea after the family harvest service tonight. There's pizza, free pizza no less, after the 6:30. And once a month, on the 4th Sunday of every month, we gather together here to break bread, to eat, to share life together. And the purpose of all these changes is to create a culture of discipleship that shapes and creates our life together, focused entirely on the one who gives us life. Speaking at his inaugural sermon in November 2005, the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, said this: "The scandal of the Church is that the Christ event is no longer life-changing. Instead, it's become life-enhancing. Until we rediscover the joy and power that makes real disciples, then we are merely consumers of religion and not disciples of Jesus Christ. Through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, there came into the world a new power that transforms human character and communities and liberates us from anxiety, fear, meaningless, transient, evil, ignorance, guilt, and shame. God's good news isn't for the chosen few. It's for everyone. And our call is to live and be good news to everyone." John Sentamu continued his sermon by saying this: "Wouldn't it be fantastic if people not only said of Jesus Christ, 'What sort of man is this?' but said of us, his followers, 'What kind of people are these?' Their gracious actions and the language on their lips is of God's goodness and love. Let's get to know them." God is at work in the world today, quite beyond the limits of our budgets, of our structures and strategies, or even of our expectations. His gospel, lived out in corporate discipleship, in lives shared together, has the power to transform our individual and corporate lives, our families, our communities, our city, and our nation. It has the power to break beyond our timidity and our insufficiency. The Jesus who calls us to follow him speaks to us today and says, "Hear, O Durham, The Lord our God is the only Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And love your neighbour as yourself. I want to end by going back to that theme of sharing, or more precisely in this context, to one of bringing. In the Old Testament, when they spoke of giving, of tithing, they didn't actually talk of giving. They talked about bringing. Because the language was that God already owned everything that we had. It came from him. So when we give to God, we're not really giving. We're bringing back to God that which is his. Now, next Sunday, for the community, the regular worshippers here, next Sunday is our annual gift day, when we ask those who are members of this community to review their annual financial giving and to consider whether they can make a gift to fund the ministry of this church. Now, usually when we come to do this every year, we do it with slight embarrassment, with a degree of hand-wringing, and with slight awkwardness. But today, this comes without an apology. It comes only with an appeal for each of us to live out the discipleship to which we are called. Not to give to God that which is already his, but to bring to God the best of what we have, in recognition and thankfulness that it was all his to begin with. And with that appeal comes our heartfelt gratitude to all of you who give what you do already give, both financially and in other ways, in the offering of all your gifts. Now, regular members of the church will already have received emails informing them how to contribute to Gift Day. If you are one of those and you haven't received the email, do pick up an envelope from the desk or look on our website. But to end, I want to enter into a new tradition. This is the second time it's happened, the second year running. Therefore, technically, that makes it a tradition. So I want to hand over to J. John to explain once more, as we heard last year, how donuts can encourage us to bring to God what already belongs to him.